This episode is brought to you by Roundtable Group, the experts on experts. We've been connecting attorneys with experts for over 30 years. Find out more at roundtablegroup.com.
Welcome to Engaging Experts. I'm your host, Noah Ballmer, and today I'm excited to welcome Mark Elmendorf to the show. Mr. Elmendorf is principal at Root Associates, an environmental consulting and management firm. He is an expert in regulatory analysis, risk management, hazardous materials, and a whole lot more. Mr. Elmendorf is a sought-after public speaker and expert witness. Mr. Elmendorf, thank you so much for joining me here today on Engaging Experts.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm excited.
Let's jump into it. So you've been in environmental consulting for, nearly 40 years, it looks like. How did you first become involved in expert witnessing?
I had been doing consulting for a while, and I was working with a couple of attorneys who had cases I was working on with them, doing like some expert reports. And two of their cases actually were going to go to trial. So they asked me to testify and spent a couple of weeks getting prepped, meeting with them, and testified, and both cases turned out quite well for them. There was an insurance carrier involved, and they were very happy with the work. And I just really enjoyed doing it. It was something different. You really got to use your expertise and the matter that at hand. It was enjoyable working with the attorneys and seeing the strategy they were using to try to get their side of the story across as strongly as possible. A little nervous the first time you actually go to court and you're up there and it's very formal. And when you're testifying, I've always found that part of it easy, because I'm prepared. I know exactly what I'm going to say. Pretty much, not exactly, but pretty close. Cross the examination, that's the part where a little more stress, because you really don't know, what they're going to say. I was told by an old attorney early in the game, yes or no is the best response for cross-examination questions. Don't offer anything, just yes or no, and stick with it.
It's interesting. I've had so many experts come on that have been doing it for a very long time, but very rarely, if ever, have been in actual court setting, because so many of these go to settlement. So it's interesting that your very first shot, you were already right in court.
I think in our field, and I know you do a lot of different areas,
of course,
the expert witness realm, but in the environmental business, I think a very large percentage of the cases have insurance coverage. So you have an insurance carrier that's in there saying, it's going to cost us this much to go to trial. Let's start offering, incremental amounts going up and up and see if we can settle this out and avoid going to trial. And that's why so many of the cases sell.
Right, exactly. And that's true in a lot of different industries. Let's talk a little bit about initial phone calls. So you get a call out of the blue, somebody needs somebody with your particular brand of expertise. How do they vet you to make sure that you are the correct expert for the job? And how do you vet them to make sure that it's an engagement that you are the right person for and have time for?
Well, usually, they'll ask for a CV and an interview, and then they'll ask you to provide very specific experience examples. I just started a case out in California that involves gasoline exposure, and they wanted me to provide them with example cases and projects that dealt with very specifically tank systems, gasoline, BTEX contamination, air exposure, that type of thing. So I wrote up about 10 different cases, background information, and sent it out to them with my CV. And then we had an interview that lasted probably about 45 minutes. Then they asked me, do you kind of go through some of the cases? I always ask a lot of questions because I want to make sure there's not going to be a big surprise once I say, yeah, okay, I'm ready to go with this. So I want to know, all the parties involved, whatever information I have to describe to me exactly what the case is about. How many people are involved? How many plaintiffs involved? What are they claiming? Property damage, is it health damage, is it contractor problems, whatever, just so you really kind of understand. We do a conflict check on all the parties right off the bat before we commit to anything. Make sure, and you'd be surprised, we're a decent sized firm. We represent a lot of the bigger corporations out there. So there's probably 10, 20% of my cases I had to turn down because we have a conflict.
Oh, no kidding. That happens a lot for you, huh?
Yeah. And we have a bunch of nationwide contracts with some of the bigger corporations. I mean, just to be on the safe side, if they're involved in any way, I hate to do it, but I usually turn it down.
Sure.
Once in a while, I try to get around it one way or another, but I find you start to open up the door to problems. You say, well, we'll put up a firewall and we won't talk to people or whatever, but you're still on the other side of that company and it could come back to bite you.
And of course, the attorney doesn't want a conflicted expert any more than you want to be part of a conflicted action
Right.
because it can, remove their best expert from the action.
It could complicate cross because if they wanted to, they could twist that somehow about your involvement with one of the plaintiffs. You wouldn't look good. Just if it was a jury trial. And sometimes there's multiple RU people working on these projects. We're all going to be on the same page with what we're going to do.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk a little bit about trial teams. So, in larger actions, a lot of the time, it's not just one expert witness and it's not just one attorney. There's a whole team of people playing together, sometimes apart. To what extent do you work with the entirety of the trial team? Do you work in any way, shape, or form with the other expert witnesses? Do you work with a multitude of attorneys, paralegals, assistants, and so forth? Tell me a little bit about the makeup of the trial team.
Most of the time, there's several attorneys involved. There'll be an associate attorney or paralegal, somebody else that's kind of the day to day providing documents and getting questions. There have been times where I've interfaced with other experts. The focus of that has always been not necessarily exchanging documents, but having conversations to understand where each of us was going to make sure we weren't going to contradict each other. A common point that we were going to get to, make sure we're all on the same page so it looks good. You don't want one person saying this, another person saying that, 5 minutes later.
Is that something that your attorney sets up or that
Yeah,
you
yeah,
do?
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the attorneys would handle getting that in place.
And I assume that whenever you're talking to another expert, there's an attorney present?
No, not always. Yeah, they're pretty open with that. When we do expert reports, which is really a big part of what I do on those cases, I think following the legal credo, they're not supposed to comment on your expert report. They're supposed to give you guidance. We'll exchange ideas and stuff. You want everybody to be happy with the focus of what the arguments are going to be. Everybody's making those arguments in their documents. The attorneys are filing motions. You've got your reports. You might have rebuttal reports once the other side comes back and complains about your report, talks about how stupid you are, and how much of a moron you are, and you don't know what you're talking about. And it's good to share. Let me put it that way. You've got an idea of what everybody's doing.
Tell me a little bit about your report writing strategy. How do you go about starting a report? Do you like to use demonstratives? Do you like to use indexes?
I have a real organized way that I do it. I'm very good at expert reports. I've always gotten very good reviews on my expert reports. I start with an outline, and I know the front end of my report is going to be background information, and that's easy. That's good. And what I do is I start with it with I make an outline, and I start by deciding what my opinion points are going to be. So I might end up with 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 points that I'm going to make. Opinion 1: plaintiff failed to do A, B, and C. And then I go to the next one and I get that because I don't want to have duplicate arguments in the expert report. I want to separate the issues as much as possible into kind of, a fine-tuned argument. So each opinion is very unique
Right.
and covers one important topic. If it's I worked on a big PCB case a couple of years ago up in New England, and I broke it down into failure to review relevant information, misinterpretation of sampling results. I broke it down into topics, and that reads well because then it's okay. They're going to have to come back and they're going to have to address each of those points separately, not merging everything together and blending everything. It's very specific topics. And then each of those topics will have reference material, background information, maybe other documents that the plaintiff has provided or documents that we've found as an attachment, an analysis if necessary that we've done on something. Even if it's costing information, we'll do a cost analysis and paste that summary right in there so it's right up front and center. I did a fracking case that should have been $30,000, $40,000 claim, and it turned into a $3 million claim. And A lot of that argument was based on failure to operate their site properly. I went through every piece of equipment, every dike, every containment system, everything, every single individual item, and said, this is what the industry standards, state regulations required. This was what they had. This is why it was inadequate. This is why it was inappropriate. And it went on, boom, 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 So, and even if they found a strong argument for one of those items, there was 40 items.
Right.
Like they're never gonna walk away from all of it. To wrap it up, after all the different opinions, I did an analysis that said, look, if they had been operating the site properly, this is what would have happened. Boom, boom, boom. A, B, and C. The cleanup cost for that would have been $40,000. They could get home. That was an insurance coverage where they were trying to subrogate against other parties to recoup that $3 million. And they didn't have a good argument.
It sounds like you write your reports in anticipation of their rebuttal.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you have to do that. I mean, it's something different. I did a criminal case a few years back that I thought was very interesting. Two small business owners were being sued by the EPA and charged with criminal violations. I did a report, but that really wasn't the main focus. The main focus of that case was being in the courtroom every day for 4 weeks and giving my team of attorneys as much advice as I could on how to cross-examine the EPA's witnesses. And that went really well because the EPA's witnesses were horribly terrible. One of their witnesses was so bad, the judge offered to call a mistrial because the witness was just that bad and contradicting himself and putting information on the table he shouldn't have been putting on the table. But that's another example of how we can help. They retained me. I went and I sat in the back of the courtroom every day. And at the end of the day, we would get together for a couple hours, review the testimony, and come up with a list of cross-examination questions for them to put out, for them to go and attack the witness. But again, their witnesses were terrible. And it looked good for us because at the end of the day, they were found innocent of all charges. It was great.
What's your rebuttal strategy when you're writing a rebuttal report against somebody else? Do you find that the opposing reports are usually as well organized as your own?
Too many of these people, and I would never say this to somebody's face, I find a lot of the expert witnesses put in way too much background information. That PCB case, the first rebuttal report I got back, and it was probably 80, 90 pages. And I have to say probably 75 of those pages were just background information. Studies he quoted, EPA documents he quoted, and just paraphrasing. It had nothing to do with the case. And he starts it out by on the first page basically saying, well, this guy's a moron, doesn't know what he's talking about. But the fact, stick with the facts. I would never issue a rebuttal report and say, yeah, this other expert's a moron, which happens more than you think with these people. It diminishes your credibility right off the bat, that you're not sticking to the case and the facts. If you have an argument to make that you're right and I'm wrong, make that argument and explain why. What are the facts? I said they needed to do this under this regulation. Is that wrong? Well, if it is, explain why. Quote the regulation. Is it a definition, misinterpretation? Is it something like put something on the table that makes sense? Not just I disagree with you.
As somebody who's been doing this for a while, have you seen any significant changes in expert witnessing in general? Has technology changed? Has timing changed?
I'm old, so we want to talk about technology changing. I can take you back to fax machines, couriers, and, FedEx. Binding your own documents in the back room, 9 o'clock at night, to make FedEx before they close. Yeah, the young kids today have no idea what any of that's about. PDF and email something, like, I don't know. It used to be, let's punch the damn thing and get that binder thing on there to hold it together.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Run to FedEx by 8 o'clock to make sure you got the package out to get it out to, the next state so the lawyer's happy. I tend to think over the last 10, 15 years or so, the insurance carriers have gotten much more aggressive with wanting to settle cases. And I don't know if that's really a cost function, policy function, whatever, but, the bigger carriers, and we work for pretty much every insurance carrier out there, they really just don't want to go to trial. And maybe because, there's been some unfortunate bad outcomes when they do go to trial. So they just decided that if we can avoid it, let's pay a few bucks.
Does the move towards settlements affect you as an expert witness, your ability to work and make money? Because obviously can potentially make more money than if it
Oh,
settles
sure.
rather quickly. So how has that affected your business?
Yeah. I mean, we leave a lot of money on the table when these cases settle because you just get that phone call all of a sudden, but we settled, stop work. Or says you might have another 6 months worth of work on that case if it was going to trial.
Do your contracts anticipate that at all with like non-refundable retainers, ways to make that up a little bit
You
on the
know,
front end?
I think everyone kind of does that differently. Again, I'm kind of old school, so I don't even ask for a retainer most of the time. I probably should, but I don't. I do a quick 1-2 page retainer agreement. I do a flat hourly fee for everything.
Sure.
Some guys have all different rates for expert reports, trial testimony. I used to use this rate for everything. Keep it simple. Expenses plus whatever. I think the attorneys appreciate that. It makes it simpler for them too.
Sure.
And then, I'll do a, estimated not to exceed for the different phases of a case if they want it.
Okay.
The ones guys I work with a lot that don't even ask for that anymore. They just say, get start reviewing stuff. And it could be some effort sometimes. I mean, they send you over 100 pages of documents. It takes me 10 minutes to go through that. They send you over 20,000 pages of documents. Although lots of times, 90% of that information is worthless, you still have to go through it. And it's costing information. And I can get one of our staff people to summarize it for me
Mm.
to save money. I'll do that.
Sure.
If somebody sends me again, $3 million worth of invoices, I'm not going to sit there and, I don't psych that fast. I'll get one of my staff people to sit and pull all that together in a nice organized fashion. So I can just look at that and understand, what we have.
Is the expectation from your engaging attorney that you will look over all materials that are sent, or is that more in case you need it, here it is?
I think 95% of the time they expect you to look at what they sent you. Again, because they're relying on you to pull out if there's something important in those documents that they're not catching. And even though they might be an environmental attorney, they may not have the expertise in that particular area. Again, whether it's tracking and, well drilling, PCB management, air emissions, whatever, like, and they're looking for you to say, oh, here's, not the magic bullet document, but, these 10 documents are important. Like,
Mhm.
make sure you understand these. And usually that's what ends up happening is it's a large volume of the material is kind of worthless, but there'll be some good stuff in there that you can use if you're going to do an expert report.
As somebody who has spent a significant amount of time actually in courtrooms and underwent cross-examination, what is your preparation strategy? You're gonna go into a potentially contentious situation, you're gonna undergo cross. How do you get ready the day before, the morning before?
I tend to, I'll review my report to make sure that I refresh my memory with what I said. Because they're certainly going to ask you about that one way or another.
Sure.
And if there's any other experts or rebuttal reports, I'll go through those again also, just so I'm familiar with that. Because again, they'll probably rely on their own experts' reports to try to throw something at you. Just say, well, you said it's going to be $20, and our guy said it's going to be, $1,000, and this is, you disagree with this because they said this, whatever, So kind of familiarize you with it. It doesn't jump you. You're not surprised. All of a sudden, ooh, why is he saying that? And in the back of your mind, you can kind of start to formulate what your response would be. You say, oh, they failed to take this into account, or you know, they didn't look at this properly. It should have been this way. It should have been that way. That type of thing. Or where you got your information from. We did, like that criminal case was ESHAP related, and one of the charges was they drove a piece of mechanized equipment, a bobcat, basically, on top of asbestos floor tile.
Mm.
We drove it back and forth. And EPA was charged with a criminal charge for doing that. And I knew that wasn't right. And I remembered it wasn't right, but I couldn't remember exactly why. I'll be honest.
Sure.
So we went back to the hotel that night and I did a little research on my computer and I found what I was looking for. And there was an EPA document that talks about what's allowed under the asbestos niche app during construction activities. And sure enough, on page like whatever, 16 or 17, there's an entire page that talks about how you're allowed to drive specifically, and it mentions you're allowed to drive bobcats on top of this tile. No problem. We don't care. So I was able to, well, it was great because I was able to give that to my attorneys. And, when they get the cross the next day, they introduced that as evidence. They put it up. We have a criminal crowd. They have these giant screens everywhere. They put it up on one of the screens and the guy was on the stand. They said, "Could you read that for us?"
Mhm.
And now what do you think about this? Like this, that kind of stuff. Like that's where we really bring value to the team.
Well, speaking of interesting cases, do you have any other tentpole cases which either change something about the way that you go about expert witnessing fundamentally or reinforce something that you are already doing?
One of my earlier cases was an insurance case for a contractor was involved and he was accused of contaminating this big mansion out on the end of Long Island, one of these big, Wall Street guys, the $50 billion, mansion. And I was able to figure out things that they had done previous to this contractor doing work on the house that caused as much of a problem as anything else. And they were looking for millions of dollars. They wanted to basically cut this place out. And we put all these items on the table to basically say, then they had them subpoena one of these other contractors for their files. They didn't put them on the stand, but we had their files. And they were able to question me to review those files. They introduced those files into evidence, and I was able to review those files, which was basically say, a month before this guy did anything, you hired this team to come in. And if anybody contaminated anything, it was these guys, because this was what they did. It was great, and I testified. It was probably the second or third day of the trial, and they settled that night. And, and then the insurance carrier had a representative there. And a few days later, he called me and said, yeah, look, they knew there's no way they were going to get a favorable, you know, uh, after all this information we put on the table. So that was good. So that kind of taught me, you know, don't just look at one angle of it. Like really dig, like if you think there's any possibility that there's additional data you can look at or additional information that you need, dig for it. The answer might be no. It might be a dead end. You're not going to do anything, but there could be some good stuff there. And the benefit of the doubt. I mean, you want to make it so it's not a slam dunk. So if you can put again, you can put that. Oh, maybe there might be an issue here. I think maybe the experts might not agree with you, but I think the attorneys, especially the attorneys that have a lot of trial experience, they know. These plaintiff guys know, ooh, they're going to start bringing a lot of doubt here. This is not going to be an easy one to win. So they'll be more inclined to settle in a favorable fashion to your client. Maybe take a little less money, make it a little more simple. Again, each case is different, obviously. We do a lot of, we've been doing a lot of cost recovery cases because obviously everybody wants money. So, they're attractive cases for the attorneys to take. And under the regulations, there's multiple avenues to bring third party cost recovery suits. So, again, everybody wants money, they really do. It's like, the subrogation, the way subrogation works, this person's not giving you enough money, you go after that person, and it's not even that person, it's that person's insurance carrier. So it's an insurance carrier against insurance carrier. And they all have budgets. They all, like, I can go this eye, I can go that eye, whatever.
Do you primarily represent defendants?
Pretty much exclusively.
Exclusively, almost. Is that ever a liability to?
No, I mean, look, if you testify, usually the first hour is, them chewing you up for your background, your education, your life, your mother, the fact that you only represent defendants, what you charge, but just and it's not even a policy. Like, Rue doesn't say, oh, you can't represent plaintiffs, because we do at times. The thing is, most plaintiffs don't want to pay to hire, good expert. And just my personal stance on this, I hate working for homeowners or property owners. I would not want to make a living doing that. People just don't. They just don't understand, I think, how this whole thing works. And I've had some really wacky plaintiffs come to us wanting to hire us. And they're like, I don't think so. I don't want to get involved in that. I don't know what you're thinking here, but we had a guy. I mean, for example, I did a favor to an attorney that I knew, still know. There's a fire in this guy's house that was mainly a smoke fire. Big place. Hired a guy to come in and hand stain all the woodwork. He put all his rags in a metal can at the end of the day, went home. A lot of people don't know, but when you do that, those rags will self-combust. So that's what happened. So the house was completely filled with smoke. So this guy sues. The insurance carrier went in, they offered 20 different things to clean the house, restore it and get it back to where it needed to be. So this homeowner goes out and hires this indoor air expert from, I think, Oregon, who rang up like, $60,000, $70,000 in bills writing this expert report. That was one of those reports where all it was photocopies of other documents. So I didn't want to pay him. But his conclusion at the end of the report was basically he had to tear the house down.
Mm-hmm.
Because these micro particles of soot got into everything in the house, and you're never going to get them all out. So because of that, you got to tear the house down. So they went to mediation. The guy, he never got paid, he never showed up. The guy's got nobody there to take his sign on stuff, but just kind of showed me like, again, I don't want to work with homeowners, like, and they get wacky. So the wackiest people, I can tell you stories. I won't get into it, but I can tell you stories, where even working for the defense, like, the homeowners are just strange, and it's not what I want to do for a living.
Sure. Let's talk a little bit about class actions. I see that you have been involved in some class action cases.
Yeah.
How is that different for an expert witness? Does that change any fundamental part of the job, or is it business as usual?
I would say it's and from what we do, our expert area, it's pretty similar. It doesn't change a lot. You have to kind of be aware of the fact that you're going to have different endpoints.
Hmm.
So, like, I did a school district related class action, and so there was, multiple plaintiffs involved that they had signed up. I think it was like 15 or 16 different families. And you had to put the time in to really kind of at least try to understand, were there any differences between those parties? They're all living in the same town, same kind of house, or was there, substantial differences? And I'm not talking like background, income, that kind of stuff, but just when it's an exposure situation, you need to understand, where these people are, what kind of housing they have, what kind of exposure scenarios they might have seen, what are they claiming, how they got exposed, where they got exposed, and try to come up with similarities and differences. Because they're going to be they're going to try to argue it's a unified class. So there's going to be some commonality among the parties.
Right.
And if you can point out that that's not the case, it's good to know. It's good to have that information. Like another weird case, we were able to demand that they test the residences of all the parties. And it was class action, so really unlimited number, of plaintiffs. They had deemed, to get their class action certified. And the levels of contamination in most of these residences was higher than the buildings and the exposure scenarios that they were putting in their case. So the case didn't go too far.
Let's back up to a couple general questions. When you first get engaged, you sign the engagement letter. How do you start off on the right foot and maintain that momentum throughout the engagement? Make sure that everything goes smoothly, that you're communicating with your attorney. What are the important aspects, the important factors in a good expert attorney relationship?
I keep a running inventory of everything we're doing. So when they send me documents, whatever it might be, I'll start an index of those materials. So I can provide that to the attorneys to say, so far, this is what you provided. If I'm looking for additional documents, the same thing, I'll have one list that I keep a running list of, these are the things I'm looking for, so I can update them and remind them, don't forget, I'm still looking for this and looking for that. So again, just to make sure we're all on the same page with, what I think is important that we review.
Sure.
And if it's, additional costing information or, if one of the reports mentions a document that somebody might have looked at or, they reference something that I think would be good to have, we'll pull it out and put that on the table so everybody knows about it. And I think that's a good way of doing it. And then I like to get deadlines in writing. So, if they're saying, okay, we're going to need an expert report, I'll say, okay, I'll have it done by this day, I'll have the draft done by this date. Does that meet your schedule? And if it is, email or a quick letter or whatever, just so I have that, formalized. That's what we're doing. So there's no surprises.
Right.
I don't want somebody coming back and say, you're late with something. And I said, well, I told you it was the 15th and it's only the 10th. Well, you need it quicker? Let me see what I can do. I don't know. I won't refuse to do it. I'll just say, that the only case I'm working on, I got a bunch of other stuff going on. I'll be more than happy to prioritize. It's important to you, I'll work this weekend if I have to. I will get this done for you. And most of the attorneys are pretty good. They understand with stuff. And I think everybody appreciates being organized. So they know, what they have coming up. They're trying to find stuff. And it makes it easy for them too, because if you go to them and say, oh, okay, please go to plaintiff counsel
Hmm.
and request these documents. I mean, it's easy for them because they just cut and paste and shoot your email off. They don't have to go digging through everything trying to figure out what they're supposed to ask for. So I think that helps them too on their end.
Similarly, are there any red flags either during the initial conversation or during the engagement itself that really make you think, oh, this maybe isn't headed in quite the right direction?
I've only worked on one case where I wanted to get out of it. And I ended up having a long discussion with the attorney saying, I really don't feel comfortable with this. And it was a landlord, pretty big property owner. And I got through a reference, this attorney called me, wanted me to get involved. Usual, a lot of questions back and forth. Some tenants were suing for habitability issues, exposure issues. And at first cut, didn't seem that unreasonable. And then they sent me their first discovery, which included a whole bunch of photos and some videos from inside a couple of these buildings.
Hmm.
Ooh, I would have sued, I just couldn't, there's just no way I couldn't, I could stand in front, no matter how hard I thought, there was just no way I was going to be able to testify that this was a reasonable situation. It was
Sure.
bad, you know. So I said, I'm not going to charge you, but my advice is settle this out as quick as you can, because I'll tell you the stuff they send me, you put that in front of a jury, no one would not convict this guy. It was that bad.
Before we wrap up, do you have any last advice for expert witnesses or even attorneys working with experts?
Again, I think getting organized, get a good punch list together, get an index together, take the time to talk to your experts. Don't just say, yeah, I gotta do this. Like set an hour aside, go through the case in detail. Like, we need to understand as much detailed information as possible so we can help you out. And for consultants that are a little newer to the game and they're trying to get into this, like, don't be so nervous about it. If you know your specialty, go for it. Just get organized, make sure you're comfortable with the cases that you take. The better attorneys will help you out. They'll prep you, they'll work with you to get you where you need to be. And, it's to their benefit that you turn out to be a good expert witness for their case. If it does go to trial, improve your writing skills.
Hmm.
I can't stress that enough. These new generations of kids that are coming up can't write a thank you note. I don't know what they're teaching them, but some of the stuff you read, you'd be like, how did, where did this come from? Like, this is bad. You might have an engineering degree, but you can't write a sentence. You're not going to be an expert witness. You're not going to be able to put those reports together. They have to read well.
Right.
Proof your work. You do something, you put it together, set it aside for an hour, go back, go through every line. You do not want any errors in these documents. Every error, every mistake, every typo, it all makes your credibility reduced. The documents got to be tight. You got to spend the time to go through, get somebody else to look at them. We have a technical editor in our firm. And lots of times when I'm done, I've been through it so much I can't go through it anymore. I'll send it to her. And have her go through it. Make sure I'm not missing anything in my punctuation or, a comma or, whatever, and I think it matters. Not all attorneys, but a lot of attorneys are very good writers. Appreciate well-written documents.
Absolutely sage advice. Mr. Elmendorf, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Anytime.
And thank you, as always, to our listeners for joining us for another edition of Engaging Experts. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, Engaging Experts. Our show notes are available on our website, roundtablegroup.com.